A cup of blood. Kosakai Fuboku. 1. The idea of karma is the foundation of Buddhism, and we Japanese have traditionally been dominated by this idea of karma, and we often tremble in fear that if we do something bad, we will inevitably be punished for it. Once this fear has taken root in a person's heart, it gradually grows until something bad happens, and finally the fear itself leads to a terrible event. There have been many cases since ancient times where people have suffered terrible curses after killing others, and I think it is fair to say that in all of these cases, the fear born from the torment of conscience led the person to invite the curse. Although it is true that such curses often seem like coincidences. That's why it's called divine or divine punishment, but as Poincaré said, coincidences should actually be considered a complex necessity so that it is impossible to find a cause, and I would rather interpret the coincidences that appear in ghost stories and causal tales as this complex necessity. I believe the story I am about to write is one that should be interpreted in the same way. This incident happened in my hometown, XX Village, XX County, Aichi Prefecture, in 1905, a time when most of the soldiers who had gone to war from the village had been killed in action and people's nerves were extremely tense, so it shook the hearts of the villagers and made such a deep impression on them that they still cannot speak of it without trembling. The story begins with a love story between the only son of a wealthy village family and the daughter of a poor cotton stripping shop. The man was Kimura Yoshio, a student at a private university in Tokyo at the time, and the woman was Arakawa Asako, a rare beauty for a country girl of 20 years old at the time. Yoshio and Asako had been childhood friends, and as their houses were separated only by a forest of a guardian shrine, the two would often play in the sand within the shrine grounds. However, as they grew up, they naturally drifted apart. Yoshio went to middle school in Nagoya, while Asako stayed at home, working diligently to help out with her father's small business. Even when Yoshio happened to come home for the holidays, the two would merely exchange seasonal greetings. However, after Yoshio graduated from middle school and went to study in Tokyo, his attitude towards Asako was no longer as indifferent as before. In particular, Yoshio had learned to frequent the pleasure quarters of Yuri after being invited by his bad friends in Tokyo, and even so, at a time when the so-called hot-bloodedness of adolescence was easily aroused, it was not difficult to imagine how much the beautiful appearance of the innocent Asako had moved his heart. And so, perhaps because Yoshio's passion was so strong that he conquered Asako, or perhaps Asako had also secretly harbored feelings for Yoshio, the two of them eventually became close in secret. Looking back now, Yoshio's love contained many impure elements from the beginning, whereas Asako's love was pure. And so, once that pure love fell apart, Asako's determination led her to completely curse Yoshio. 2. There are many examples throughout history of love that often bring about horrible outcomes, but Yoshio and Asako's love affair was brought to an end by Asako's sudden blindness, which was a bold and fleeting one, but Yoshio himself forced it to end. In this sense, readers may not feel much sympathy for Asako, but if you knew that Asako's blindness was actually the result of Yoshio's infection with a serious disease, you would undoubtedly hate Yoshio for abandoning Asako. What's more, if you put yourself in Asako's shoes, how sad it must have been. Having been made blind at birth and then being thrown away like an old pair of shoes, there was no way to stand or survive. "Dad, what should I do?" Every day, she would cry and plead with her father, saying this. It was painful enough to see his child's once beautiful features change so horribly, but the thought of his only dependable daughter now disabled and having to care for her in the opposite way for the rest of his life was so painful that it made Tenshichi feel like he wanted to dig his heart out with a dagger. However, since Yoshio's late father had once taken such great care of him, Tenshichi could not bring himself to resent Yoshio, and he sighed and tearfully said, "Asako, please bear with me. It's all my fault. You are the one who has to pay for my sins." Tenshichi was born in Aichi Province and ran away with another man's common-law wife, and the two of them had been wandering around the village, relying on a distant relative in the village. However, that distant relative had not died at the time, so she was forced to cling to Yoshio's father, who was a man of great chivalry and built a small house on a vacant lot nearby, gave them both a place to live, and helped them start a cotton beating business. Soon after, the couple had a child, Asako. However, as soon as she gave birth to Asako, Asako's mother went mad and threw herself into the river and died. Tenshichi believed this to be divine punishment and had been raising Asako ever since, living as a widower, but he could not help but think that the fact that misfortune had once again befallen Asako was retribution for the sins he had committed. As a husband who has done me a great favor, I cannot say anything bad about Yoshio. Asako, please just think of it as bad luck and give up. Thus Tenshichi comforted Asako, bowing as he spoke. When Asako and Yoshio's love began, Tenshichi had sensed it early on, but for the reasons mentioned earlier, he had turned a blind eye. Since they were of different social status, he thought that a marriage between Yoshio and Asako was impossible, but he was not entirely angry at Yoshio's treatment of Asako, leaving her disabled and abandoned, never to look back on her again. Unlike Tenshichi, Asako believed Yoshio's words and thought that she would be able to marry him. That was how great her grief was when she was abandoned. And when she thought that Yoshio's sweet words were only spoken to satisfy her lust, she was so frustrated that she could not stand still. Even when Yoshio returned home on vacation, he no longer peeked into Asako's house. And so, before he knew it, Asako's presence had disappeared from Yoshio's heart. However, as Asako's presence faded from Yoshio's heart, in contrast, Asako's thoughts of Yoshio and her resentment towards him grew stronger and stronger. 3. It was the middle of the night one winter day. Suddenly, Tanjiro woke up and saw that Asako, who should have been sleeping next to him, was nowhere to be seen. He put his hand under the futon and found it was still warm. He thought that she had probably gone to the bathroom, so he waited for a while, but there was no sign of her returning, so he called out, "Asako, Asako," but there was no reply. Tenchichi was overcome by a frightening premonition, so he quickly threw on his kimono and went outside. The moon was high in the sky, bright, and the surroundings were quiet, and Asako was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, when he listened carefully, he heard what sounded like clapping coming from the shrine grounds. Tenchichi thought this might be it, so he went inside the grounds and approached the source of the sound, where he found Asako kneeling before the gods, clapping her hands and praying for something. After concentrating on her prayer for a while, Asako stood up. Stretching her hands out in front of her, she walked towards an old pine torch, but as soon as her hands touched the pine, she stopped and took out what looked like a white doll from her pocket. Tenchichi walked over to her side on tiptoes, trying not to be noticed, and on closer inspection he saw that it was a straw doll measuring 6 or 7 inches in height. Asako held the straw doll perfectly against the old pine tree with her left hand, and with her right hand she took out a shining silver nail from her sleeve. Needless to say, she was planning to crucify the straw doll, which resembled Yoshio, to the pine tree. Just as her right hand was about to stab the doll, Asako's right arm was held down by Tenchichi's hand. "Asako, what are you doing?" "Dad, I'm so frustrated." As soon as she said this, Asako collapsed and leaned against her father, put her sleeves to her face, and cried loudly. Rather than sympathizing with Asako's broken love, Tenchichi could not help but shudder at the fear in his son's heart as he imitated the Ushi no Toki Mary. When Tenchichi felt the trembling of Asako's undulating body illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees, he was startled as he recalled the feeling he had when he had touched Asako's mother's corpse, which had been pulled from the river 20 years earlier. Asako, too, bore the blood of her mother, and when he thought of the possibility that she might, after becoming overwhelmed, do something terrible, it felt as if all his blood had frozen. "We don't want to catch a cold. Let's go home and get some sleep." Tenchichi was finally able to comfort Asako and return to her cool bed. After this incident, sadly, Tenchichi's prediction proved correct, and Asako's mental health began to show signs of becoming increasingly abnormal. Every night, She would sneak out of the house late at night and wander about like a sleepwalker. At first Tenchichi tried to stop her, but it seemed that doing so only aroused her more, so later he let her do as she wanted. She never went out during the day, and being a blind woman, she did no harm to other family members or strangers, so Tenchichi left her to her own devices, but later she began climbing trees and walking on other people's roofs at night, which made the villagers feel uneasy, so Tenchichi decided to keep an eye on Asako and not let her go out at night. When the villagers found out about what had happened, they felt great sympathy for Asako, but there was nothing they could do, and Asako's mental abnormality worsened with each passing day. 4. Just then, the villagers suddenly heard that Yoshio was going to marry a woman, and were struck by a strange feeling. Yoshio's mother had been very fond of her only son and had been letting him do as he wanted, but now when Yoshio fell in love with a distant relative's daughter and said he wanted to marry her while he was still in school, his mother not only did not object, but she gladly agreed, wanting to see her first grandchild as soon as possible. Things were quickly moved forward, and it was decided that Yoshio would wait until he returned home for spring vacation to get his wife. When Yoshio returned home, he heard for the first time that Asako had gone mad, and although he had never thought anything of Asako's blindness until then, he felt a strange sense of unease at the thought that she had gone mad because of him. He couldn't help but feel a certain fear when he heard that she had walked on the roof of another house at night. Moreover, this time he was to welcome his bride, which made him feel even more uneasy. So, unusually for him, he resolved not to go outside until his wedding day. Even though he was from a wealthy family, the preparations for his wedding were quite extravagant. However, everything was carried out smoothly without any hitches or problems thanks to the relatives and people who came and went, and finally, at last, the wedding was to be held at his home at the beginning of April. On the morning of the day, the sky was pleasantly clear, but suddenly it became cloudy just after noon, and in the evening, by the time the bride was to arrive, a spring rain began to fall lightly. However, the bride and her party made it safely into Yoshio's house, and the wedding was held shortly thereafter in a detached room. The ceremony was held solemnly in the 8-tatami room by the light of a candlestick. Outside, the spring rain was falling in strength, and the sound of it beating the leaves of the trees in the garden could be heard solemnly. The round-faced bride looked a little pale, perhaps from excitement or the light from the candles. The groom, Yoshio, also looked unusually gloomy. From the main house, the noisy voices of people coming and going could be heard frequently. Finally, it was time to arrange for the 339 cups. The sake cups, Meko and Ocho, were carried by 2 young girls who were relatives. The matchmaker and his wife, the bride, and the groom. Tension was filling the faces of all four of them. Soon the cup was brought in front of the bride. With trembling hands, the bride picked up the cup. The girl lightly poured the sake into it. And then, plop! A drop of red liquid fell from the ceiling into the cup, spreading out in a flash to fill the cup. Just as she thought this, another drop of red liquid fell into the cup. Whoa! The bride let out a horrible scream and dropped her sake cup, and at that moment several drops of red liquid trickled down from the ceiling, painting an untimely autumn pattern on her dress. The bride groaned at the sight and passed out on the spot. 5. I'll leave it to the reader's imagination to guess what kind of commotion broke out in Yoshio's house after that. The bride was put to bed in another room and given first aid by a doctor called from a nearby town, and was revived for a time, but that night she developed a high fever and was unable to get up. The red liquid that had dripped from the ceiling into the bride's sake cup was, needless to say, blood. Why and what kind of blood had spilled? People were suspicious, but no one was afraid to go to the attic to check. Yoshio was extremely nervous after this unexpected turn of events and infuriated by the people's cowardice, so he suggested that he explore the attic himself. "What is this?" "It's just blood from a cat eating a mouse," he said, and went to get a ladder, removed a corner of the ceiling board, and entered the ceiling with a candle in hand. The people heard the sound of Yoshio walking. Soon after, they heard a terrible groaning sound and a heavy crash. "Young master! Yoshio-sama!" the people shouted in unison, but there was no reply. The men and women looked at each other in extreme fear. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. There was still no sound from the ceiling. Then, again, a few drops of blood trickled onto the tatami mat from the same place. Yoshio's mother cried like a madman and asked the people to go up to the ceiling and examine it. As it was no longer time for the people to hesitate, they called 3 young men who frequented the main house and had them climb up into the ceiling. The scene the 3 men saw by candlelight after climbing up to the ceiling was truly horrifying. The 3 men say that even now, when they think about that time, it sends chills down their spines. Yoshio was not the only one on the ceiling. Directly above where Yoshio was lying unconscious and facing up, with a thin belt tied around the beams in the attic, was the pretty Asako, who had hanged herself to death with a terrifying expression on her face. The people first carried Yoshio out. Yoshio soon regained consciousness thanks to the doctor's treatment, but as he fell, the candle he was holding fell on his face, and unfortunately the light burned his right eye and went out, causing frequent pain in his right eye. The bride suffered from a high fever and the groom from excruciating pain in his right eye, and the wedding ended in disaster. Everyone was horrified at the terribleness of Asako's obsession. But that was not all the misfortune. The bride's condition then worsened to cerebrospinal meningitis, and after about a month her temperature returned to normal, but her brain had been infected and she had become idiot-like. Furthermore, the wound in Yoshio's right eye unexpectedly became severely inflamed, and although it would have been better if it had been removed sooner, it was too late and he developed sympathetic ophthalmia, and the same inflammation in his left eye occurred, and he was eventually forced to go blind in both eyes. You reap what you sow. Yoshio finally atoned for his sins with both his eyes, but when he thought about how his sin had extended to his innocent bride, he regretted his actions against Asako, even now. Naturally, Yoshio felt too embarrassed to stay in his hometown, so he sold the ancestral home and moved with his mother to the outskirts of Nagoya. It is still a mystery as to how Asako managed to sneak into the attic of Yoshio's detached room. Needless to say, the blood that dripped into the bride's sake cup had flowed from Asako's hanged body and accumulated on the ceiling, but the fact that it ended up in the sake cup offered by the bride must have been an extremely fateful coincidence. Yoshio later recounted the time when he went exploring in the attic, saying that Asako's hand, who had hanged, beckoned to him, and he was instinctively drawn to it, but I think this was probably an illusion caused by the dim candle light. Even so, it seems more than just a coincidence that the candlelight fell on his right eye as he fell. One last thing. The day after Asako's funeral, Asako's father, Tenshichi, left the house in a nonchalant manner and never returned, so even now the people do not know whether he is alive or dead. Some villagers have a cynical interpretation that Tenshichi must have deliberately made Asako go out on her wedding night, since there is no way he would have known about her going out, even though he had been watching her up until that point, but no one can really know if that was the case.